All right, so let's talk about some of the technologies involved when we start to create some of these bots. Number one, we talked briefly about QNA. And QNA is our Azure service that's built off of Azure Search. And as we look into that, basically when you send it a question through a REST endpoint secured by a subscription key and the rest, you're going to get back an answer, and that answer is going to have a score, which is from 0 to 1. Think of it as a percentage score of how much that question matched the question in its database, not exactly word for word, but using our own internal fuzzy logic, how well it matched. The next piece of information that's important is metadata that we can put in specifically. This allows us to separate one group of information from the next. The example we normally give is kind of around restaurants. If you're looking for a restaurant in the northeast side of town versus the southwest side of town, they may have different operating hours and the rest that you could store into a QNA database. And given that metadata of which restaurant you're looking at, the QNA database can respond differently and give you the answer that is most appropriate for the context that you're using in that. So that's going to allow us to do that kind of information, that kind of parsing behind the scenes very quickly. But once again, that is stuff that we would have to set up. The next part is really around within the Q&A section itself. It's really about either a single turn or a multiple turn. Now, when I say a single turn, I am responding to everything you need. You have given the bot in one way, i.e., give me an example of what you think a single turn question may be. It's a question that has all the information you need in it related to, say, OCP CRM. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
How many partners in United States?
There we go. Okay, so given the information that we have in OCP CRM, we should be able to put that information into a Q&A database, and it would have everything we need to solve that particular question, right? In that case, that question would probably go to a larger piece of a functional going out, but for the purpose of this discussion, if we put that information into a Q&A database, we have everything we need there. However, there may be additional follow-up questions one would want to ask that are basically related to that same thing. So if we start with how many partners are there, the follow-up question to that we could put into the Q&A database would be, how many services partners do we have in the United States, right? Which would be a follow-up, once again, context specific, that allows us to get that information in and out of that environment. So Q&A is a standalone service built on Azure Search. So it's accessible from not only bot technologies, but from other areas as well. So we're going to see different applications using Q&A in order to enhance their applications. All right. So I'll move from Q&A over to LUIS itself. And like I said, I'm going to go through each of these concepts, and then we'll take a look at some physical examples a little later. So LUIS is our Language Understanding Intelligence Service, and it's really what I consider a service that's going to allow us to take information that we give it, i.e. an utterance, and it's going to parse that from a natural language processing standpoint into two things. Number one, it's going to give us intents, and these are actions that we want to take as a result of that utterance. And then the second one is entities. So entities are the data within that utterance that we want to act upon. So I typically use a calculator example when I talk about this with people. So when we think about how we do calculations, right? If we say the phrase, add or what is 4 plus 7, all right? So if we say, just go ahead and start actually typing this while I'm in here. What is 4 plus 7. All right. From a intent, which is an action, we want to do a calculation. And I say calculation instead of specific add, because when we look at what we have in here, we have a couple entities. These entities. So we have a number, which is 4. We have an operation. Addition. And then we have a number, 7. So does that make sense to everyone?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes, it does.
Okay, now we may look at that and say, Michelle, apparently you want to control?
No, I hit the wrong button, sorry.
No problem. Well, we look at that and we say, well, how does that change? Why wouldn't we just put a prompt in directly? So the reason for that is when we want to use LUIS, we want to put a number of components in place that will allow us to have the users operate into a much more conversational manner. When we're just looking at typing that in, that is one way of looking at that. But what happens if the user would actually over voice and would say, what is 84 minus 16? So as you go for and you're trying to parse that information out directly, right, you'd have to say, okay, what is the pattern for that number 84? Well, we already have those patterns in LUIS that understand that that's a number. And we also have minus, right? In this case, we've said minus, which should map to a subtraction rather than simple minus, or less, or something like that. So we can put our own information into LUIS. That's going to allow us to map that language into something that we can then use and act upon. And those are the reasons we would want to go and use LUIS within our solutions. So we have intents, which are our actions. We have entities, which is our data that's going to be pulled in and out. We also have patterns that we can look at. If we said we want to have a operand 1, then an operator, and then behind that have another operand, we could do it that way as well. We have a limited amount of those we can use within LUIS, but those also give us some more flexibility as we want to move forward with some more complex bits of information. We can also make these very context specific, which we'll look at a little bit later. Okay, everyone clear on LUIS? And we'll move on to adaptive cards. Adaptive cards are the grouping, if we will, to allow us to have a simple to find interface that goes across different channels. And when I say channels, let me back up just a moment. A channel is a way of interacting with the bot. So the channels that we expose, generally people work with bots, are really going to be around things like web chat, which is a control that you can drop into a web page and then make a connection back to the bot and work with it that way. By the same token, there are other channels. So Skype is one, Twilio is one through SMS. We have Kik, we have WeChat, I believe they're working with, and we keep adding these channels over and over again. So Facebook Messenger is another one. Each of these channels has a different set of properties we would use to interact with them, but that abstracts the connection to the user away from the bot developer and allows us much more flexibility to interact with our user. However, because each of these channels is going to have a different way of looking at it, we need kind of a common interface for defining what we're getting or displaying to the user. And that is really around adaptive cards. So adaptive cards, let me try to bring up a site here for that. And I may have to stop sharing this and share that back. Okay, so adaptive cards, as I said, is a tool set that's going to allow us to exchange rich snippets of kind of a native UI, in our case relative to a bot, but across any of these different channels. And as you can see, the URL for this one is https://adaptivecards.io. And it has a couple pieces in it that are of pretty decent use for us. Number one, I start with the samples to take a look at that. And on the left side, they will have different samples for how we will define these. And these are JSON structures that we can use to define exactly what our card looks like. So in this case, you see an activity update card that's being created. On the JSON is in the center. And then on the right side, we see what that adaptive card will look like in a different context. And if we try to look at it from different ways, I'll go ahead and open this. From a designer perspective, we can see that we changed the host app, which is what we look at there. So that's what it looks like in a web chat. We have it in Cortana Skills. We have it in Microsoft Teams, which is another important channel for us. And you'll see how that card is going to change just a bit as we get the information in, and then we transform it back over to the user. There are a number of different components that we can use. If we look at the Schema Explorer itself, it will tell you all the various elements that we can continue to use. On the right side, it will tell you what version it is available in, because the host is going to be separate from the schema itself, and different hosts and versions have the ability to render it just a little bit differently. So that's going to give you a little more flexibility, but that is driven either by that distinct host, or you can come up with your own custom host to get that information corrected. One of the things that we are currently working on is down at the input level. So if you look on the right here, you'll find information in kind of in the 1.2 that's really around the inline activity, which will tell you what we can do with that. And there's also one at the bottom, which is around requires, which tells us whether or not what it requires. In an earlier version of adaptive cards, they also had a kind of information to say whether or not this was a required field, what the error text would be if you did not fill in that field. So this is an area where it continues to evolve. This will allow us, as we're creating bots, to collect a number of pieces of information at the same time, rather than just continue going back and forth with the user. There are a couple ways of getting information back. The number one way is what we call this application submit, in which case it's going to take all the data and submit it back as a JSON value, which we have to handle slightly differently within our bot as we move forward with that. And that's something we'll discuss as we get into true bot development from a coding standpoint. But I want to make sure we talk about what these concepts explicitly are. So as I said, these are adaptive cards. They show us and give us an interface and a way to define our interface for the user to collect that information and to send it back. If we look at our virtual assistant that we're creating for the health bot, that first information we get in that welcome card is in fact an adaptive card that we can then customize to do different pieces in different environments, whether it's a picture, whether there are links that we want to work with that. So that's an example of us already using the adaptive cards. And in most of the samples on Bot Builder, they're going to give you that as a starting point, although they don't typically explain what that is or how we then go about using that. But that's something we can certainly go into at a deeper level. So